There are stories that drift through time like whispers carried on damp wind. Some are too strange to be dismissed, too cruel to be forgotten. This is one of them. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. The Village of Shadows. The year was 1889, and in the valley of Carmarthenshire, Wales, a village clung to the hillside like lichen to stone. It was a place of coal smoke and chapel bells, where families lived in cottages of slate and stone, their lives bound to the rhythm of the earth and the seasons. The people worked hard, prayed harder, and trusted little that could not be seen. Among these villagers, the Evans family was ordinary in every way but one. Father David Evans worked the fields and sometimes the mines when work demanded. Mother Eleanor tended to the hearth, sewing until her fingers bled to feed 7 mouths. But it was not the eldest son, nor the weathered patriarch, who drew the eyes of neighbors. It was the twins, 2 girls born in the same hour, sharing the same face, yet walking 2 paths no one could understand. June and Margaret Evans. The village knew them as inseparable. They shared dresses, shared food, shared the small straw mattress pushed against the damp wall of their room. At school they sat side by side, whispering to one another as if the world outside their bond hardly existed. Teachers would later confess they never once remembered seeing one without the other. But as the year turned, something began to fracture that bond. A silence fell, a silence so complete that even the crows seemed to mark it. A silence begins. The first sign came during a lesson at the village schoolhouse. The children were reciting their verses, and when it came time for June to speak, she simply did not. Her lips pressed together, her dark eyes flickering with something unreadable, and though the school mistress repeated her name sharply, June sat unmoved. The children laughed, thinking it a stubborn refusal, but she never spoke again. At first, the Evans family believed it was illness of the nerves, perhaps a chill or shock from a fall. But days stretched into weeks, and June's silence remained absolute. No coaxing, no punishment, not even whispered prayers at her bedside could break it. She would not even answer Margaret, her twin, though her eyes followed her every movement. What unsettled the villagers most was what followed. As June withdrew into silence, Margaret seemed to grow louder. Her voice filled rooms, her laughter echoed in fields, and she carried both sides of conversations with ease, as though she was speaking for 2. It was then that whispers began to stir, not of sickness, but of something stranger. Whispers of the parish in that part of Wales. The chapel ruled as firmly as any crown. The minister, Reverend Griffith, was quick to declare the silence unnatural. From the pulpit he spoke of spirits that latch on to children, of demonic influences that can twist the innocent tongue. The villagers shivered in their pews as he declared, to refuse speech is to refuse God's breath. The Evans family endured the scrutiny of neighbors. At markets, women would cross themselves as June walked past, pale and thin, her lips clamped shut like a lock upon a secret. Men muttered that such silence was not natural, that twins themselves carried omens, for were they not Cain and Abel reborn? But within the Evans cottage, it was Margaret who defended her sister. She speaks, Margaret insisted one evening to her mother, not to you, not to them, but to me, always to me. Yet no one else ever heard a sound. The first omen, in the autumn of that year, Margaret fell ill with fever, her cheeks burned, her breath rattled, and still June never spoke. She remained by her sister's bedside, unmoving, her eyes fixed like 2 coals in the half-dark. One evening, while tending the fire, Eleanor Evans dropped a coal upon her daughter's bare hand. The flesh burned, and the smell of scorched skin filled the air. Yet June made no cry, no whimper, no sound at all. Her silence had grown deeper than flesh. It was then the family realized, something more than mere will bound her. The village records, what we know of those years comes not only from rumor, but from the records that survive. The school mistress noted, the Evans girl, June, no longer participates. She stares without expression. The other twin answers for her, as if one soul moves both bodies. The local physician, Dr. Meredith, wrote in his ledger, mutism unexplained. Patient shows no sign of hysteria, but of possession of will. The twin Margaret shows heightened vitality, almost unnatural vigor. Priests recorded exorcisms attempted, psalms chanted, holy water sprinkled, even the laying on of hands. But June never opened her mouth. It was as though her silence had become her very flesh. A glimpse beyond the window. One neighbor, Mrs. Llewellyn, told a story that clings to the case like ivy to stone. She swore that, passing the Evans home at dusk, she saw two figures in the upstairs window, not unusual, for the twins often played there. But one stood utterly still, shadowed, while the other moved about freely. When she mentioned it to Eleanor, the mother paled and said, "But June has not risen from bed this day." Two figures, yet only one child awake. Seeds of dread. By 1891, the silence was accepted as part of the Evans household. Margaret thrived in school, though she never ceased speaking of her twin, as if June's silence were a conversation only she could hear. She would pause mid-sentence, tilt her head as though listening, then answer aloud to what no one else had heard. Her classmates grew uneasy. Some refused to sit near her. One boy later wrote in his diary, "It is as if the silent one lives inside the other. When Margaret speaks, she smiles too widely, as if someone else is behind her teeth." Teachers punished her for daydreaming, but it changed nothing. The twins' bond was deeper than rules or reason. The silence of June Evans is the silence that haunts archives and parishes alike, for in every account, doctor, priest, villager, there is the same conclusion. Her muteness was not chosen, but shared, a pact of blood and breath, unspoken but binding. We have only begun the descent into their story. What lies ahead is darker still. Death, apparitions, and a voice that returned only once, on the very night one twin was laid in the earth. This then is the opening to the manuscript of shadows. June Evans, the twin who never spoke. A child's silence, a family's shame silence in a home can be a balm. Yet in the Evans household it grew into a shadow that pressed on every wall. The hearth crackled, the children bickered, and Eleanor hummed her weary hymns as she mended torn sleeves. But always the silence of June hovered above it all. At supper, Margaret's voice would carry across the table, telling stories of schoolyard games, reciting lessons, describing the walk through fields. She spoke in detail, often turning her head toward her sister, as though waiting for a reply no one else could hear. "June says you should not burn the bread," she once told her mother. "She says it tastes like coal." Eleanor, weary from hunger and shame, struck her with a wooden spoon. "Do not speak for her," she hissed. "God hears lies." But Margaret wept not for the sting, only for the injustice. "It isn't a lie. She tells me. She always tells me." The other children avoided June. She would sit stiff in her chair, hands clasped, lips sealed tight, her eyes fixed not on them, but on Margaret, as though her whole existence were fastened to her twin alone. And the more June sank into stillness, the brighter Margaret seemed to blaze. The priest's visit. Reverend Griffith returned in the spring of 1890, carrying his heavy Bible and suspicion in equal measure. He had heard of the girl's continued silence, of the way Margaret now spoke as if with two tongues. He sat before the twins, his black coat smelling of candle wax and old wool. "Child," he said to June, "do you not wish to praise the Lord with your voice?" June lowered her eyes. Margaret leaned forward. "She does," she whispered. The priest frowned. "How do you know her thoughts?" "Because she tells me." Griffith pressed his lips tight, then ordered them both to kneel. He prayed over them, voice rising, hands trembling. The room filled with his thunder. The children pressed against the floor. Yet when he commanded June to repeat the psalm after him, her lips remained locked. It was then Margaret's lips moved instead, not to echo the psalm, but to whisper a word Griffith swore he had never spoken aloud, a word he refused to write in his parish journal. He only recorded. The other girls spoke for her. It chilled the blood. The secret in the barn. The Evans family kept livestock in a weather-beaten barn behind their cottage. It was there that the first secret was glimpsed by Thomas, the eldest son. One night, sent to fetch kindling, Thomas saw the twins huddled together in the shadows. No lantern burned, yet their faces were turned to one another, close, too close, as though whispering through breath alone. Margaret's mouth moved, lips fluttering with words. June's lips remained sealed, but her eyes glistened with feverish intensity, darting in rhythm with Margaret's speech. Thomas froze. He swore later to his own children that in that moment, he saw June's throat move, muscles twitching as though she too were speaking, yet no sound emerged. He dropped the kindling and fled, heart hammering. He would never again go to the barn alone. The schoolroom incident. It was in the cramped schoolhouse, one damp October morning, that the silence grew dangerous. The children were practicing their copy work, the scratching of pens filling the air. The schoolmistress turned her back to fetch a book from the shelf, and the class sat in quiet, all except Margaret. She tilted her head toward her twin and began to laugh, soft at first, then louder. June sat rigid beside her, eyes burning, lips pressed as always into that impenetrable line. The laughter did not stop. It grew high-pitched, hysterical, echoing off the stone walls. The schoolmistress whirled, shouting her name, but Margaret clutched her sides, tears streaking her face. Still laughing. June says, she choked out between gasps. June says the master will die. The room fell into silence colder than frost. Later that month, the school's headmaster, Mr. Pritchard, a stern man known for rapping knuckles raw, collapsed in his own home seized by apoplexy. Whispers spread like wildfire. Some claimed Margaret had cursed him, others said it was June, speaking through her sister's tongue. From that day onward, children crossed themselves when they passed the Evans twins in the lane, a mother's desperation. By winter, Eleanor Evans had grown desperate. She could no longer bear the stares at market, the muttered curses outside her door. She sought out a healer, an old woman named Catherine who lived by the river. Catherine was known for poultices, for muttered charms against the evil eye. She agreed to see the twins, though she demanded payment in wool and bread. She examined June first, touching her brow, her throat, her lips. Then she turned to Margaret, who watched with wide unblinking eyes. "It is not sickness," Catherine said at last. "One has given her voice to the other. The silence feeds the strength of her twin. They share more than blood." Eleanor trembled. "Can it be undone?" Catherine shook her head. "Not without tearing the thread between them, and threads once torn can unravel a soul." The village divides. By 1891, the Evans family stood at the center of a rift. Some villagers pitied them, whispering that the girls were touched by madness, victims of misfortune. Others condemned them outright, believing the twins a curse upon the valley. Sheep went missing from a nearby pasture. A cottage caught fire after lightning struck. Children fell ill with fever, and in each misfortune, neighbors saw the Evans girl's shadow. It became common, walking home in dusk, to hear muttered words. "The silent one brings death, the laughing one carries it." Father David Evans grew bitter. He forbade Margaret from speaking of June's messages, but Margaret defied him. She continued to speak for her sister, her voice growing sharper, stranger, as though carrying two tones at once. The dark journal among the few relics that survive from the Evans household is a small journal, leather-bound, stained with soot. It is believed to have belonged to Eleanor, though many pages are torn. Several entries remain. March 1891. "She has not spoken in 2 years. I dream her lips move, yet the sound comes from Margaret. I cannot tell which child lies beside me in sleep." June 1891. "I caught them in the yard, their foreheads pressed together as though stitched. Margaret's lips moved, but June's breath misted the air, as if she were the one speaking. I felt watched, though no one was near." September 1891. "Margaret told me June says she hears voices in the walls. She laughed when she said it, but June's eyes looked upon me with such hunger that I shook." The journal ends abruptly. The warning at the chapel one Sunday. Reverend Griffith refused the family entry into service. Standing at the chapel door, he declared before the gathered flock, "A house divided by unnatural bonds is a house that tempts the devil." The Evans family turned away in silence, shame burning their faces, yet Margaret smiled faintly,
clutching June's hand, as if she alone knew something the minister feared to say aloud. That same evening, villagers walking past the chapel swore they heard two voices inside, one chanting in Margaret's higher pitch, the other deeper, hollow and unfamiliar. Yet when the door was forced open, the chapel stood empty. By now, the Evans story was no longer just a curiosity. It had become a source of dread, dividing neighbors and haunting the family's every step. June's silence was no longer seen as illness. It was a covenant, a dark tether that bound the twins in ways no scripture could explain. Already, a pattern had formed, the weaker one growing silent, the stronger one blazing with borrowed fire, and in that imbalance something unnatural was beginning to stir. A house that listens. The Evans cottage, though humble, was built from thick stone and timber. Its walls sweated in the damp, its windows rattled at the touch of wind. Yet in the years of June's silence, the house itself began to feel alive. Family members spoke of hearing faint murmurs at night, words slipping through cracks like drafts, though no one outside was near. Eleanor often rose in the dark hours to hush her children, only to find them all asleep. And still the voices continued. It was Margaret who explained them. "They are not outside," she whispered one morning to her mother. "They come from inside the walls." When Eleanor pressed her, Margaret only smiled. "June hears them clearer than I do."
But June, seated at the table with her folded hands, only stared. From that moment, the Evans home was no longer a refuge. It became a listening ear, a shell that caught and echoed the twins' strange bond. Father's unease, David Evans, though hardened by mine work and poverty, found himself shaken. He began to drink more heavily, muttering about curses and shame. At night he swore he heard footsteps upstairs, though all his children lay accounted for. Once, returning from the fields, he found June standing alone at the window, staring into the yard where no one stood. Her lips were pressed shut as ever, but her breath fogged the glass in steady rhythm, forming shapes that looked like words, though none he could read. "Why do you watch the empty yard?" he asked gruffly. June did not turn. Margaret, entering behind him, answered instead, "Because it is not empty." David struck her across the mouth. "Hold your tongue, both of you." But even as he raised his hand, June's eyes never left the yard. The burial of a lamb. One spring morning, Thomas Evans discovered a lamb lying dead near the barn. Its small body bore no wound, yet its eyes bulged as though suffocated. The family buried it in a shallow grave. That night, Margaret told her siblings in a hushed, almost gleeful tone, "June says it will not stay buried." The next morning the soil was disturbed. The lamb's body lay atop the mound, stiff and cold. Thomas swore his sisters had dug it up, but when pressed, Margaret only smiled. June wanted it closer. The villagers heard of this quickly. Some whispered witchcraft. Others claimed it was proof of possession. Either way, the Evans name grew darker still. The locked room. Eleanor, frightened for the safety of her younger children, began locking June and Margaret in their shared bedroom each night. The door was heavy oak, the latch firm, but several times David found the door unlatched in the morning, though no key had turned it. Inside, the twins lay side by side, their foreheads touching, eyes closed. On one such morning, he noticed the words scratched faintly into the wallboards above their bed. "She won't leave me." Neither child could read or write beyond their school lessons, and yet the letters were carved with such precision, it seemed the work of an older hand. The teacher's confession. In 1892, the school mistress, Miss Price, confessed something troubling to the parish council. She had caught Margaret one afternoon whispering rapidly beneath her breath, while June sat rigid, staring at her ink-stained hands. Miss Price leaned closer, thinking Margaret was reciting her lesson. Instead, she realized the child was repeating her own words back. Every phrase Miss Price had spoken in class that day, spoken in perfect rhythm, tone and accent. Yet June's eyes shifted, as if directing the cadence. "I felt," Miss Price later wrote, "as though the silent one were using her sister as a mirror, and I, without knowing, had been speaking to two mouths all along." The Dream of Water. Eleanor's journal. fragmentary as it is, contains one entry from midsummer of 1892, July. Dreamed the girls walked into the river. Margaret laughed, the sound bright, but June did not move her lips. I woke to find them standing by my bed, their hair wet, as if from rain. Yet the sky was clear. They said nothing. I did not sleep again that night. It was this entry that convinced later folklorists the case had entered the realm of the uncanny. How could children appear soaked in water when no rain had fallen? And why did Eleanor never confront them about it? Some argue she was already too broken to ask. The neighbors watched by this time. Villagers no longer hid their suspicions. Groups of children were forbidden to walk near the Evans home. Mothers clutched their infants when the twins passed. One neighbor, Evan Hughes, swore he saw the girls standing in the fields at dusk, their shadows unnaturally long, stretching in opposite directions, as though each had its own son. He muttered. Another villager claimed that when Margaret laughed, June's breath fogged out, as if she had exhaled in unison. Soon few dared to speak to them. The twins became figures of dread, spoken of only in muttered tones at chapel and tavern. The secret confided. It was Margaret herself who revealed the most unsettling truth. One night, speaking to her younger sister Bethan, she whispered a confession. June doesn't need to talk to me with words. I hear her here. She tapped her chest. Sometimes I hear her louder than my own thoughts, and when she is angry, it hurts. Bethan, frightened, asked what June grew angry about. Margaret only smiled. She doesn't like when people look at me more than her. She says I belong to her, always to her. Bethan never forgot those words. Years later, she would tell her own grandchildren. It was not Margaret speaking that night. It was June using her mouth. The fall late that autumn, a violent storm shook the valley. Roofs leaked, streams overflowed, and the Evans children were kept inside. It was during this storm that Thomas, climbing the ladder to the loft, fell and struck his head. He survived, but for hours he lay unconscious on the floor. Eleanor wept, praying for his recovery. Yet as she prayed, Margaret leaned close and whispered, "June says he will wake, but he will not be the same." When Thomas finally stirred, his words came slow, broken. His memory faltered. He complained of hearing whispers no one else heard. The family began to believe June's silence had spread beyond her. The Evans family could no longer pretend their burden was private. The silence had seeped into their home, their neighbors, their very dreams. What had begun as one girl's refusal to speak had grown into something larger, something that touched livestock, neighbors, siblings, even the walls of their cottage. And through it all, Margaret shone brighter, sharper, her voice carrying more than a child's voice ever should. It was as if June's silence was not absence at all, but a force, a hand guiding, pulling, feeding. The village had begun to fear them. The family had begun to fear themselves. The curse was no longer hidden. It was everywhere. The parish archive. Much of what we know from these years comes from documents, parish notes, medical ledgers, and scattered testimonies recorded decades later. It is in these brittle pages, stained by time and candle smoke, that the true weight of the Evans case begins to reveal itself. The Reverend Griffith, stern as he was, left more than sermons. In the margins of his Bible he scribbled, "It is not only silence. The girl June's muteness feeds the other. The house itself seems bound by their bond. If the Lord does not intervene, I fear it will not end with children's games." That entry, dated November 1892, shows a clergyman wrestling not just with faith but with dread. For even men of God, those who claimed certainty of heaven and hell, hesitated to name what lived between the Evans twins, the Evans attic. It was Bethan, the youngest daughter, who stumbled upon the attic secret. One afternoon she climbed the narrow ladder, seeking a shawl. The air was heavy with dust, the rafters groaned, and there in a corner beneath a slanting beam she found a bundle of rags. Unfolding them, she discovered scraps of paper, pages torn from a school primer. They were covered in jagged handwriting, shaky yet deliberate. On each page was written the same phrase again and again, "I am here, I am here, I am here." The letters were pressed so hard they tore the paper. Bethan carried the scraps to her mother. Eleanor blanched, for neither June nor Margaret had shown the hand for such script, and yet the scrawls bore the unmistakable clumsiness of a child. When confronted, Margaret only shrugged. June wrote them, she said simply. But June does not write. She does, Margaret replied, when she wants to be heard. The pages were burned that very night, yet Bethan swore the smell of charred paper lingered in the attic for months. Dr. Meredith's report, the physician, Meredith, returned in early 1893 to examine June once more. His notes survive, preserved in a ledger at the Carmarthenshire Archives. Patient appears pale, underweight, pulse steady but weak, responds to touch yet not to speech. Not hysteria, but willful silence, or more troubling, a silence imposed. But it was his addendum that unsettles even now. While examining the mute child, her twin sat nearby. I observed her lips moving in mimicry of my own. As I asked questions of the silent one, the other whispered my very words back to me, not in jest, in unison, like a voice split in two throats. Meredith recommended separation of the twins, an idea Eleanor refused outright. To part them, she told him, would be to break them. The market incident that spring, Eleanor dared take her daughters to market. Bread was low, coal scarce. She hoped presence in the open might quiet the villagers' suspicion. But as they passed the stalls, a woman selling wool called out, "Which one speaks for the devil?" The words struck like a lash. Margaret froze, clutching June's hand. Then she laughed, a sharp sudden sound that startled even the sheep. "Neither," she said. "He speaks for us." Gasps filled the market. June stood silent, her eyes glistening. From that day no vendor sold to the Evans family without inflated price or muttered curse. Hunger settled into their home as firmly as the damp. The hidden confession. Years later, a set of notes surfaced from a lay minister named Daniel Roberts, who occasionally assisted Griffith. Roberts had visited the Evans cottage at night to pray over the children. In his papers, he wrote, "The twins sat opposite me. I asked the mute one to bow her head. She did not. Instead, her sister bowed twice, as if for both. I spoke a blessing, and the silent girl raised her eyes, fixing me with a stare so cold I felt stripped to bone. At that moment, the other spoke, but her voice sounded layered, two tones, one high, one low. I could not tell which child addressed me. I fled without finishing my prayer." Roberts never returned. The families divide by midsummer of 1893. The Evans household itself had begun to fracture. Thomas, the eldest, avoided his sisters entirely. He took work in another parish, seldom visiting home. Bethan clung to her mother, refusing to sleep in the same room as the twins. She told neighbors she heard scratching at her door each night, like fingernails dragging along wood. David drank heavily, disappearing for nights on end. Eleanor grew pale and sleepless, muttering prayers even while she worked her needle. Only Margaret seemed untouched. She grew taller, stronger, her cheeks flushed with life, yet her laughter rang strangely hollow, as though echoing from someone else's throat. And June, thin still, her silence absolute, watched them all with eyes that never seemed to blink. The funeral procession. In the summer of 1893, cholera struck the valley. Several cottages lost children, and funerals passed through the chapel almost weekly. The Evans family attended one such burial for a neighbor's boy. As the coffin was lowered into the earth, Margaret leaned close to her mother and whispered, "June says he is not alone down there." Eleanor shuddered, pulling her daughter back, but others had heard. The words spread quickly, fuel for the belief that the Evans twins saw more than flesh should see. From then on, some villagers refused to allow the girls near burials, fearing they would speak with the dead. The bedroom door. One night in late August, Bethan awoke to creaking. Through a crack in her door, she saw the twins standing in the hallway. Their hands were clasped, their faces turned toward her door. She held her breath, feigning sleep. Then came the scratching, slow, deliberate, like nails etching wood. Margaret's whisper floated through, "June says let us in." Bethan buried her head in the blankets, trembling until dawn. In the morning, the wood bore faint marks. Eleanor dismissed them as rats, but Bethan knew the sound of fingers. The fading line. By September of 1893, Margaret's vitality seemed unnatural. She spoke endlessly, filling silence with chatter, songs,
even sermons she had never heard. Yet there were moments when her voice shifted, lower, harsher, as though borrowed from elsewhere. Neighbors began to remark she looked less like herself, and more like June, pale, gaunt, eyes darkening at the edges. It was as if June's silence was not only feeding Margaret, but shaping her. And then in October the unthinkable happened. Margaret fell ill. A fever burned her, rattled her lungs, weakened her laughter. For the first time in years her voice faltered. She grew quiet, and with her silence, June grew colder still, her lips tighter, her stillness deeper, her eyes fixed with unbroken hunger. The balance between them was shifting, and what that shift would bring, no one could imagine. By now the Evans story was no longer whispered curiosity, it had become a dread, shared by an entire valley. Villagers spoke of voices in walls, of laughter in wrong tones, of doors scratched at night. The family themselves carried secrets, burned writings, journals hidden, confessions, torn from priests, and as Margaret's health faltered, the silence of June loomed larger, heavier, as if waiting to consume what remained of her twin. The story was moving toward a breaking point. The physician returns. When Margaret fell ill in the autumn of 1893, the Evans family again summoned Dr. Meredith. He arrived by carriage, coat damp with rain, his satchel heavy with instruments and ledgers. He found Margaret fevered, her lips cracked, her once bright voice reduced to hoarse murmurs. Beside her bed sat June, pale as always, hands folded, lips sealed tighter than ever. Meredith noted in his ledger, "The speaking twin is weakened, her vitality diminished. The mute one sits vigilant, eyes unblinking." I attempted to separate them briefly, to examine Margaret alone, but the silent child clung with strength unexpected. Her grip upon my sleeve left marks. He described June's gaze as possessing a quality beyond illness, like a bird of prey waiting. Most troubling of all was this entry: "While Margaret coughed in fever, I heard a second sound in the room, a low moan, not from her throat, but resonant in the silence of June." Yet the mute child's lips did not part. It was as if the fever spoke through her sister's absence. Meredith left shaken, prescribing only rest and prayer. The parish ledger. Around the same time, Reverend Griffith expanded his private writings. In the parish ledger still preserved, we find his most unsettling words. "The twins appear bound as one flesh, one voice carried between them. It is written that the devil mocks God's creation by making mirrors of man. What if these children are such mirrors? When one is bright, the other is dimmed. When one suffers, the other grows watchful. I cannot separate them in my mind. I fear to know what death would do to such a bond."
Griffith admitted he had prayed for guidance, but heard only silence, and in that silence he wrote, "I felt watched." The Journal of Bethan years later. Bethan Evans, the youngest sister, kept a notebook describing her memories. Though written in adulthood, her words still tremble on the page. "I recall one night when Margaret slept, her chest rattling with sickness. June sat beside her, awake. Her lips were closed as always, but her throat moved as though she were swallowing words. I crept closer and placed my ear near her face. I heard, though faint, my sister's fevered rambling. It came from June without her mouth moving, as if she carried the voice inside her." Bethan confessed she fled the room, never daring to sleep beside them again. The experiment. There is one story, half rumor, half fact, that emerges from this period. Some claim Dr. Meredith attempted an experiment with the girls. He asked Margaret a question in Welsh, then quickly turned and whispered a different question in English to June. Margaret answered both, first in Welsh, then in halting English. June never moved her lips. If true, it was the first documented case of one child apparently receiving and answering questions meant for another. But Meredith himself left no record of this. The tale survives only in later accounts, passed like a curse through village gossip. The silence grows heavier. By November, Margaret's fever began to subside. She regained some strength, but her voice never fully returned to its brightness. Instead, she spoke less, as though exhausted by years of carrying two tongues. It was then the silence of June became unbearable. It filled the home like a fog. Her presence grew oppressive, her eyes following, her stillness deepening. Family members avoided her gaze, for when she fixed it on them, it felt as though their very thoughts were being weighed. David Evans, once quick to dismiss, began refusing to remain alone in the same room with her. "She looks through me," he muttered after drink. "Not at me, through me." Folklore of the valley. The Evans case spread beyond the village into the wider valley. Folklorists later recorded whispers that locals believed the girls to be Tile with Teg's bargain, a fairy exchange gone wrong. Twins in Welsh superstition were sometimes seen as liminal beings, one belonging to this world, the other to the other world. A tale recorded in 1894 speaks of the mute twin who listens to the dead, and the bright twin who speaks for them. Though unnamed, the story bears the mark of the Evans family. One villager told the collector, "If you stood near their house at night, you would hear two voices arguing, one loud, one only in your head." The Cabinet of Curiosities. An even stranger detail emerges from a letter found decades later in the collection of an antiquarian named Edward Morris. In 1893, Morris visited the region, gathering curiosities. He wrote, "At the Evans cottage, I was shown a small wooden box hidden in the hearth. Within it were scraps of fabric, each marked with letters scrawled in ash. The mother wept as she displayed them, saying they appeared there without her making. Most bore the same phrase, 'She will not leave.' I offered to purchase the box, but she refused, burning the contents instead. Yet I swear when I left, I heard a child's voice behind me whisper those same words. The whereabouts of this box remain unknown." Margaret's confession. As winter pressed in, Margaret made a quiet confession to her mother. In the dim of the hearth she whispered, "June is never silent to me. She speaks all the time. Sometimes it is gentle, sometimes it is not. When I am tired, she fills me with her voice. When I laugh, it is not always my laugh. Sometimes I do not know which one of us is living." Eleanor, desperate, slapped her and told her never to speak of it again. But Margaret's words lingered, like a shadow on the wall that refuses to be erased. The collapse. By December of 1893, the Evans home had become a place no neighbor dared enter. Visitors swore the air inside felt wrong, too heavy, as though sound itself had thickened. The children grew pale, restless. The father drank himself into stupor. Eleanor kept her journal, but her entries became fragmented, prayer-like. "Lord, deliver us from silence." She waits. Not two but one. It was clear that what had begun as one child's muteness had become something far larger, something that consumed the whole family, drawing them into its shadow. The Evans story had moved beyond curiosity, beyond village whispers. It was now documented in ledgers, journals, folklore and rumor. Physicians, priests and mothers alike wrote of the same strange truth. June's silence was not absence but presence, a presence that filled others, spoke through them, bent them to her will. The family could no longer escape it. Margaret's illness had shifted the balance, and now the silence loomed heavier than ever, waiting for what was to come. The next stage of their story would no longer be about silence alone. It would be about death. A new visitor. In January of 1894, word of the Evans twins reached Dr. Alfred Crowthorne, a physician from Cardiff, with an interest in rare nervous conditions. He had studied cases of selective mutism, hysteria and what Victorians called double consciousness. When he heard rumors of the mute twin who speaks without sound, he traveled to the village, notebook in hand. Unlike Dr. Meredith, who was weary and hesitant, Crowthorne was eager, hungry for discovery. To him the Evans case was not tragedy, but opportunity. The Evans family, desperate for answers, allowed his visits. June tolerated him, sitting motionless as always, eyes following every movement of his pen. Margaret, though frail, tried to answer his questions. The examination Crowthorne's records survive, scrawled in precise medical hand, still housed in the archives of the Cardiff Medical Society. They are clinical but they chill. Twin a June complete elective mutism. facial musculature intact, no paralysis of tongue or lips, exhibits perfect hearing response but will not vocalize. When prompted with objects, bell, candle, key, her eyes widen then narrow but no sound. Twin Margaret speaks intermittently, though often exhausted. Curiously, reports hearing her sister's voices in her own head. Suspect shared hallucination. Later, place stethoscope upon throat of twinner while Twin Margaret read aloud a verse. Vibrations were detected in Twin A's larynx concurrent with speech of Twin Bacchus. Impossible coincidence. Suggests some sympathetic resonance, though no movement of lips observed. Crowthorne underlined these words twice. The voice is not hers, yet it stirs within her. The experiment in darkness. One evening, under the dim light of a single oil lamp, Crowthorne persuaded Eleanor to permit an unsettling trial. He blindfolded Margaret and whispered questions into June's ear. Margaret answered every one, not quickly, not cheerfully, but with a strange monotone, as if the words were fed into her. When the mother cried out in fear, June's eyes flickered with something sharp, almost satisfaction. Crowthorne closed his ledger, trembling. In private he wrote, "I do not believe I conversed with Margaret at all. It was the other who answered, using her as mouthpiece. The mute twin is not mute. She has merely chosen another vessel." The mark on the skin around this time, Margaret began developing strange bruises, small, round, on her arms and ribs. She swore she did not fall or strike herself. Bethan, the younger sister, remembered seeing June press her hand against Margaret's skin while she slept. By morning the bruises were there, as though the touch itself left its imprint. Folklore would later claim that June was feeding, drawing strength through touch, leaving her sister marked. Whether superstition or not, the family's fear grew unbearable. A disturbing prayer. Reverend Griffith, now nearly broken by the case, performed a small exorcism right in the cottage. He placed his hand on June's head, commanding her to speak the Lord's Prayer aloud. She remained still, lips tight, but Margaret, seated across the room, began to choke on the words. Her voice strained foreign, as though pulled from her against her will. The Reverend stumbled back, pale. He never attempted another prayer in their home again. The letter from Eleanor, a single surviving letter, written by Eleanor Evans to her cousin in Carmarthen, reads, "I fear the silence more than the sickness. Margaret wastes away, yet I feel it is June who carries death in her stillness. Sometimes I see her reflection move when she has not stirred. Sometimes I hear 2 sets of footsteps at night. The children are not alone, though we count but 2. The cousin never replied. The letter was found decades later, folded inside a Bible. The mirror incident, one of the most haunting tales of this period, is preserved in Bethan's later writings. One morning she entered the girl's room to find Margaret staring into the cracked mirror that hung on the wall, but there were 2 faces of June in the glass. One stood silent by the bed, the other stood behind Margaret's shoulder, mouth open wide as if mid-scream, yet no sound emerged. Bethan smashed the mirror with a stone shard, scattering across the floor. From that day on, no mirror was permitted in the Evans house. Crowthorne's final note. Dr. Crowthorne returned to Cardiff shaken. In his final private note he wrote, "I am convinced the mute twin harbors not illness but a parasitic doubling, a possession of voice itself. If the speaking twin should perish, I fear the other will not merely resume speech but multiply it. God preserve us if such a case repeats." He never published his findings. His notes were filed away, marked confidential, unfit for general release. The weight of the house. By spring the Evans cottage itself seemed to rot under the burden of the silence. Neighbors said no birds perched on its roof. The hearth fire sputtered more often than it burned. The windows sweated even in dry weather. Visitors described the same sensation when they entered. Their ears popped, as though the air itself pressed too hard, heavy with unspoken words. And in that hush they swore they heard the faint whisper of 2 voices layered, speaking together yet out of sync. The Evans story was no longer just a family tragedy. It had become a living record, etched in medical notes, journal entries, folklore, and whispered confessions. The silence was not absence. It was force.
It bruised, it spoke through others, it broke glass and echoed in mirrors. And as the year turned, Margaret's strength waned further. The family knew the balance between the twins was shifting, though none dared say aloud what everyone feared. The silence was preparing for something final. The winter lingers. The spring thaw came late in 1894. Snow clung stubbornly to the hills, and the fields remained sodden, unyielding. The Evans family seemed caught in the same grip, unable to shed the weight of the season, unable to breathe freely. Margaret's illness worsened. Her skin turned translucent, the veins beneath visible like faint blue threads. Her laughter, once the bright defiance of the sisters, faded into whispers, words spoken with effort. June remained at her side, unchanged, pale, unspeaking, unmoving. Her silence, once strange, had become monstrous. Bethan's notebook. In Bethan's hand we find a fragment, dated February 1894. I no longer dream. When I close my eyes I hear Margaret whispering, but when I open them it is June who looks at me. I cannot tell the difference anymore. I pray but the silence answers. She later described a night when she awoke to the sound of her sister's voice calling her name, yet when she lit a taper, she found both twins fast asleep. June's eyes closed, Margaret's lips still. The voice had come from nowhere, or worse, from both. The doctor withdraws. Dr. Meredith, who had attended the family since the twins' birth, ceased his visits. He confessed in a letter to a colleague that he could not endure the house any longer. When I step through that door, all sense of reason flees me. My hands tremble. The very air feels swollen with secrets. I am a man of science, yet I confess, I am afraid. He recommended the family seek treatment in Cardiff or even London, but they had no means, and the girls refused to be parted. So the silence grew. A record of the neighbors in the parish archives. There is a testimony from a neighbor, Gwendoline Hughes, who swore she saw the twins walking the fields at dusk. They moved as one, their steps exact, their heads tilted in the same direction. I watched from the hedgerow. At one point the speaking girl stumbled, but the mute one did not. Yet in the same instant, both cried out in pain, though only one mouth opened. I tell you this, I saw it plain. 2 bodies but 1 wound. Her words were dismissed as hysteria, but her son refused to pass the Evans cottage after dark. The darkening of Margaret by March. Margaret spoke rarely. When she did, her words were hollow, as though forced. Eleanor in her journal wrote, "My child speaks, yet I do not know if it is her. I ask her simple questions, what day it is, what she desires for supper. Sometimes she answers wrongly, or repeats my words as if mocking me. Sometimes she stares with June's eyes, not her own." The mother began to believe June was living through Margaret, consuming her voice, her will. The ritual. It was then that Eleanor, in desperation, permitted something unthinkable. An old woman from the next village, known for charms and cures, was brought to the house. She insisted the twins must be separated, not by walls but by ritual. She scattered salt across the threshold, set bowls of water beneath their beds, and placed a knife beneath each pillow to sever the tether. That night Margaret screamed for hours, not words but a terrible animal cry. June did not move, but her eyes glittered wide, unblinking, reflecting the firelight. By morning, Margaret's voice was gone entirely. The old woman refused payment. She left the house trembling, muttering that the bond was too deep. The voice returns in strange ways. Weeks passed. Then came a night when Eleanor swore she heard singing in the house, a soft lullaby, the same she used to sing to the girls when they were infants. But when she rushed to their room she found June seated upright, lips sealed. Margaret lay unconscious, lips parted slightly, but no breath stirred them. Still the song continued, filling the room, as if the walls themselves had learned to sing. Eleanor collapsed to her knees, covering her ears, weeping. The letter of Reverend Griffith, though shaken, continued to write. His final entry concerning the Evans twins reads, "I am undone. The mute child is no longer a child. She is host to something beyond my reckoning. The voice that was hers is divided, multiplied, consumed. If Margaret perishes, I believe June will inherit not only her silence but all the voices it has devoured. I dare not pray in that house. I dare not step upon its threshold again. God forgive me. Shortly after he resigned his post and left the valley, the shadow on the wall one evening, Bethan swore she saw two shadows on the wall, though only June stood in the room. One shadow matched her figure perfectly, straight, still, hair falling long, the other writhed, mouth wide, arms raised as though clawing at the air. When Bethan screamed, the shadows merged. June turned slowly toward her, eyes glistening in the dim light. Bethan fled, refusing ever again to sleep in the same room as her sisters.
The house falls silent by April. The Evans cottage became a place of near total silence. Margaret no longer spoke except in faint murmurs that barely stirred the air. June, as ever, spoke nothing at all. Yet the family swore they heard voices daily, whispers in corners, sighs in empty rooms, laughter beneath the floorboards. Visitors came less and less. The Evans' name was spoken in hushed tones. Mothers warned their children not to wander near the house, lest the silence cling to them too. The Evans family had crossed into a realm few could endure. Science faltered. Religion fled. Folklore only deepened the dread. The silence was no longer absence, no longer refusal. It had become a force that fed, bruised, sang, and haunted. Margaret was fading, and all knew it. June waited, motionless, pitiless. The bond between them strained toward its breaking point. The only question left was, when one twin slipped into death, what would the silence become? The failing of Margaret. By May of 1894, Margaret was wasting away. Her skin clung to bone. Her breath came shallow. She no longer laughed, no longer sang. When she did speak, her voice was brittle, like parchment tearing. June never left her side. She sat straight-backed in the wooden chair by the bed, hands folded tight, eyes fixed on her sister as if she were waiting. The family could feel it. Something was approaching. Eleanor's last journal entry. The mother's final surviving journal entry is brief, ink smudged with tears. Margaret sleeps more than she wakes. June watches without blinking. Sometimes I think Margaret breathes through June's chest, not her own. Tonight I heard her whisper, though her lips were still. She said, "She is nearly ready. I fear the grave will not part them." After this, Eleanor never wrote again. The night of the fever. The night came in June of that year. Margaret's fever spiked violently. She thrashed in her bed, muttering fragments of prayer, of nonsense, of terror. The house shook with the sound of her coughing, but June sat still, her pale face turned slightly, her throat pulsing with each word Margaret gasped. It was as though she drank the sound, drawing it inward. Bethan, huddled at the door, swore she saw the air shimmer between them, like heat rising from a fire, only cold, shimmering cold. The final cry. At the stroke of midnight, Margaret's body arched upward. A sound erupted from her mouth, not her own sweet voice, but a raw, guttural wail that no child should make. And in that instant, June's lips parted. For the first time in 5 years, she spoke. Her voice was low, steady, terrifyingly calm. "She will not leave me." The room fell silent. Margaret collapsed back upon the bed. Still, her chest no longer rose. The witness of Bethan. Bethan later wrote, "When Margaret died, the silence in the room was worse than death." June stood, her eyes alight with something fierce. I called her name, but she did not look at me. Instead, she looked at the body in the bed, and whispered, "I told you I would keep her." Bethan fled the room. She claimed she heard 2 sets of footsteps following her down the hall. The neighbors arrive. The next morning, neighbors came to prepare the body, but when they entered the cottage, they swore they saw not one figure by the bed, but 2. One was June, standing still, the other, her mirror, faint, transparent, eyes wide with terror. Margaret's outline but thinner, fading. By the time the neighbors blinked, there was only June. They crossed themselves and refused to touch the corpse. The burial. Margaret was laid to rest in the churchyard. Bells tolled, hymns were sung, but few dared look at June. She stood beside the grave, silent, her lips pressed shut again, but some swore they saw her whisper, not aloud, but moving her lips in time with the priest, not prayers of farewell but mimicry, repetition, a shadow voice echoing his words. When the final soil was cast upon the coffin, June leaned close to Bethan and whispered her first words since the night of death. "She is not below, she is with me." Bethan fainted where she stood. The silence expands from that day. June never spoke again, but her silence was different now. It was heavier, almost suffocating. Villagers claimed that if you stood near her, you would hear whispers beneath your own thoughts. Margaret's voice, faint, begging, pleading. Others claimed they saw the twins together still, June walking the lane, Margaret's reflection beside her in puddles, though only one set of feet touched the earth. The Evans house grew darker, colder. No one dared step within. The physicians returned. Dr. Meredith, compelled by both duty and dread, returned after hearing of Margaret's death. He recorded one final note. "I examined the surviving twin, her pulse steady, her frame unharmed. Yet when I held her wrist, I felt a second beat, faint and irregular within her veins, impossible, yet undeniable, as if two hearts dwelled in one vessel." He refused ever to see her again. The bond had broken, or rather it had inverted. Margaret was gone, yet she was not free. Her voice, her presence, her very shadow lingered in June, absorbed into that endless silence. The villagers whispered that June was no longer one child, but two, that the mute twin had swallowed the soul of her sister whole. The silence was no longer waiting, it had feasted, and what it left behind was far more terrifying than either twin alone. The true horror was only just beginning. The weeks after the Evans cottage should have been quieter after Margaret's burial. Instead, the silence grew unbearable. Eleanor, once stoic, began muttering to herself as she worked. Neighbors reported hearing her in the fields, speaking Margaret's name, answering as though someone unseen replied. Bethan refused to sleep in the same room as June. She begged her mother to send her away to an aunt's house, but Eleanor refused, claiming they must keep the family together, no matter the suffering. David Evans, already broken by drink, wandered the lanes muttering that he had two daughters still, though one lay in the ground. When asked what he meant, he only said, "Listen close, you'll hear her too." The return of the voice, it began subtly. At night, June sat in her wooden chair staring at the cold hearth. Bethan swore she heard Margaret's voice whispering, though June's lips did not move. Soon it grew louder. Villagers passing outside claimed they heard two children singing within the house. Some even swore they saw candlelight flicker against two figures through the window. But whenever the door was opened, there was only June. Eleanor's decline. Eleanor's mind faltered first. In fragments of a letter found among her belongings she wrote, "She speaks to me now, both of them. One asks for bread, the other asks for prayer. I do not know which is which. Sometimes June comes to me, but it is Margaret's eyes that look back. My heart aches, but I cannot grieve, for how do you grieve one who still sits in your house?" She stopped attending church. She covered every mirror. She walked the house barefoot at night, murmuring hymns under her breath. The night Bethan saw the truth. Bethan's account, written years later, is the most chilling. She described waking in the dead of night, to the sound of movement, creeping down the hallway. She saw June standing at the end of the corridor, but June was not alone. Beside her was a pale outline, Margaret's figure, thin, translucent, head bowed as if in shame. June reached out her hand, and the outline mirrored it perfectly. Then, as Bethan gasped, both heads turned toward her in unison. June's lips remained sealed, but the outline's mouth opened wide, releasing no sound, only a rush of cold air that extinguished Bethan's taper. She fled screaming into the night. The folklore expands. By late 1894, the Evans family had become legend. Children were warned not to wander near their land. Stories spread that June walked the lanes with a shadow no sun could banish, that she had inherited her sister's soul, carrying it like a second skin, that her silence was not human refusal, but the mark of a curse passed through blood. One tale said, if you stood near her too long, she would swallow your voice too, and you would never speak again. The father's death in October. David Evans was found lifeless in the barn. He had hanged himself with a rope of horsehair.
Pinned to his coat was a scrap of paper that read, "She will not leave her." No one knew whether he meant Margaret June, or something else entirely. The mother's madness. After David's death, Eleanor deteriorated completely. She was often seen wandering the churchyard, speaking softly at Margaret's grave, then turning as if to answer June though the child had not followed. One winter night, a neighbor claimed Eleanor stood in the road, shouting into the dark, "Which of you is it? Which of you lives?" By morning she was bedridden with fever, refusing food, whispering only prayers until she too fell silent forever. The surviving twin that left June pale and thin but very much alive. She did not weep at her parents' passing. She did not flinch at her father's burial, nor at her mother's. Bethan insisted that June was never alone. She claimed that whenever June entered a room, she felt another presence with her, the air thickening, a second pair of eyes unseen. Some neighbors swore they saw June speaking in the yard, mouth closed, throat still, but with Margaret's voice carried on the wind. The final parish note, Reverend Griffith, long gone from the valley, left one last statement in his journal, sent to a colleague. "The mute twin yet remains, but I tell you this, she is not one but two. I fear the soul of the departed lingers within her, not in peace but in bondage. I will not return to that place. It is cursed, and I believe it will remain cursed until that silence is broken, and God help us all if it ever is." By the close of 1894, the Evans story had become something more than rumor, more than family tragedy. It was a revelation of inheritance, silence passed down like a sickness, a voice devoured, a soul imprisoned. June remained, the last child in the house, yet to those who saw her, she was never alone. The silence had triumphed, and whatever lived within her was waiting for its moment to step fully into the world. The empty house. By 1895, the Evans home stood nearly deserted, the father hanged, the mother buried, Margaret beneath the cold soil. Only June remained. Neighbors said smoke no longer rose from the chimney, yet if one passed at dusk, a candle flickered faintly in the upstairs window. Sometimes two figures could be seen pacing inside, always in step, always together. Children dared one another to run to the cottage door and knock. None stayed long enough to listen. They claimed whispers bled through the wood, two voices overlapping, indistinguishable. Bethan's departure. Bethan, the youngest, was sent away to live with relatives. She never returned. In later life she refused to speak of her sisters except once, in a letter never meant for publication. June lived on, but she was not June alone. I know it in my marrow. Margaret never left her. When I dream I still hear them both, bickering like crows. When I wake, the silence lingers thick and choking. I fled, but I did not escape. Bethan emigrated to America. She died there in 1942, still refusing to let her own children keep mirrors in the house. The official records, the parish ledger, records June's presence until 1899, when she was noted as having departed the district. No details, no destination. Some claimed she was sent to relatives in Swansea. Others said she entered a convent, where vows of silence suited her perfectly. But in truth, no one knows where she went. The Evans cottage fell into ruin. The stones sank. The roof collapsed. Today only a few walls remain, hidden beneath ivy and moss. Villagers still avoid the place. They say the air is too still there, as though even the birds dare not break the silence. The folklore that followed the tale of the silent twin spread far beyond the valley. Folklorists collected versions well into the 20th century. One story claimed June could steal voices with a glance, leaving others mute. Another insisted she carried Margaret's soul in her chest, and at night, two heartbeats throbbed within her. In some versions June never died. She wanders still, pale and mute, haunting crossroads and empty chapels. Even today in that Welsh valley, children are warned not to walk alone at dusk, for the silent twin waits, they whisper, and she listens. The last echo in 1971, a visitor to the abandoned Evans site wrote in a local paper, "I stood within the broken walls. There was no sound, not even of birds, yet I swear I heard a child laugh behind me. When I turned, there was nothing but stones and shadow. The silence there feels alive. Others since have repeated the same footsteps, whispers even singing drifting faintly from the ruins. Always two voices, never one, the enduring dread. The Evans story has no neat conclusion. June vanished, absorbed into history, leaving behind only fragments, ledgers, journals, rumors and dread. But what remains constant in every telling is this: silence is never empty. It waits, it presses, it inherits. Margaret's death did not free her. June's muteness was never hers alone. Some bonds do not break in the grave, they only deepen, and so the story of the Evans twins closes, yet the silence does not. Perhaps it still lingers in ruined cottages, in empty churchyards, in the spaces between words where no sound dares dwell. Perhaps when you wake at night, straining to hear if someone called your name, you are not mistaken. It may be her, or them, together still. Do not listen too closely, do not answer back, for once you give your voice to the silence, it will never return.